The silent floors. Maggie had been working the night shift at Ravenwood Rehabilitation Center for almost 6 months. The pay was decent, and the hours were perfect for her schedule, but she'd always hated the eerie stillness that came after midnight. Ravenwood was an old building. Too old, some said. It had been a mental asylum in the early 1900s, then a tuberculosis hospital, and finally, a rehab center. The place carried an air of something forgotten, like a history it was trying to bury. Her shift that night started like any other. The halls were dimly lit, the fluorescents flickering faintly as she made her rounds. She carried her clipboard, checking off patients in their rooms. Most of them were either asleep or staring blankly at the wall, lost in their own thoughts.
By 2 a.m., the air in the building always felt different. Thicker, heavier, like it was charged with static. Tonight it was worse. Maggie felt it prickling at the back of her neck. The other nurse on duty, Beth, was down in the office, likely nodding off. Maggie felt a twinge of resentment but shook it off. She was just finishing her round on the 3rd floor, where the long-term patients stayed. These were the ones who had been at Ravenwood for years, forgotten by their families or too broken to leave. Room 309 was her last stop. It belonged to a man named Edgar, who'd been there longer than any of the staff could remember. He never spoke, just sat in his chair by the window, staring out into the darkness. His medical file was bizarrely incomplete. No last name, no birth date, just Edgar scrawled in loopy handwriting. When she opened the door to his room, the chair by the window was empty. Maggie's stomach dropped. Edgar never left his room. Her flashlight swept the corners of the room, the beam quivering slightly as she called out, "Edgar?" No answer. She stepped into the room, the air colder here than in the hallway. She noticed something on the floor, a trail of faint, wet footprints leading out of the room. They shouldn't have been there. The halls were dry. The footprints led down the hall toward the storage room at the end. Maggie hesitated. She wanted to call Beth, but her phone was back at the nurse's station, and shouting would only wake the patients. She tightened her grip on the flashlight and followed the trail. The storage room door was ajar, a thin sliver of darkness spilling into the hallway. She pushed it open. "Edgar," she whispered. The room was silent. Rows of shelves loomed in the beam of her flashlight, casting long, distorted shadows. At the far end of the room, she saw him. Edgar stood with his back to her, perfectly still. His hospital gown clung to his gaunt frame, and his head was tilted slightly, as if he were listening to something she couldn't hear. "Edgar, you shouldn't be here," Maggie said, her voice trembling. She took a step closer, but as she did, he moved, just a fraction, a twitch of his head toward her. That was when she noticed the sound. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible. A low whisper like wind through a crack, but it grew louder as she stood there, the voices overlapping, rising into a chaotic symphony of murmurs. "Edgar?" Maggie's voice broke. He turned. His face was wrong. His eyes were wide and unblinking, and his mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, too wide for his face. He began to laugh. Not loudly, but a wet guttural chuckle that made her stomach churn. Maggie froze. The whispers grew louder, and now they seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding her, pressing in. Edgar took a step toward her. "No," Maggie gasped, stumbling back. She dropped her flashlight, and the beam rolled across the room, casting fleeting, grotesque shapes on the walls. Then the light went out. The whispers stopped. The silence was suffocating. Maggie stood there in the darkness, her heart pounding, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She fumbled for the flashlight, her fingers trembling, and finally managed to switch it back on. Edgar was gone. Maggie didn't go back to the 3rd floor. She ran straight to the nurse's station, but when she got there, Beth was gone too. Her chair was overturned, and her coffee cup lay shattered on the floor. The security cameras showed nothing, just static where the 3rd floor should have been. The next morning, when the day shift arrived, there was no record of Edgar ever being a patient. His room was empty, the bed stripped, the medical file gone. When Maggie asked the other staff about him, they gave her blank stares. There had never been an Edgar at Ravenwood, but Maggie knew what she saw. And late at night, when she closed her eyes, she could still hear the whispers.
When I was 9 years old, I had a favorite TV series. It featured human actors and actors in animal suits, along with funny and educational clips in between. I won't name it because the show itself was truly wonderful, and this story isn't its fault. Let's just call it The Z Show. The Z Show had been airing for years, and I'd been watching it for as long as I could remember. Every day after school, I'd sit down with my older sister Scarlett and my best friend Brandy, who lived next door. It was our little ritual. We'd huddle on the couch with snacks, sweets if our moms allowed it, apples or grapes if they didn't. And during commercial breaks, we'd gossip about the big, dramatic issues in our 9-year-old lives. One warm summer Friday, Scarlett found a prize competition in one of her magazines. It asked questions about the Z Show, and the first prize was a trip to Disney World with your parents. But better still, anyone who sent in the correct answers would become a member of the Z Show fan club. That same afternoon, the three of us crowded together on the couch after the show to answer the quiz. The questions were hard, asking about obscure details from older episodes. Without Scarlett, Brandy and I wouldn't have stood a chance. Scarlett convinced Mom to give us stamps and envelopes. We carefully wrote our answers and filled out the forms with our names and contact information. Scarlett even suggested we vary a few answers slightly so it wouldn't look like we cheated. Then we mailed the letters and waited eagerly for our membership cards. When the first snow fell and there was still no reply, we stopped checking the mailbox. Brandy stayed loyal to the show, watching it every day. But Scarlett lost interest, and when she stopped watching, so did I. Brandy would still come over to watch, though now I'd sit next to her flipping through Scarlett's old magazines, only half listening to the familiar jingles of the Z Show. It was early spring when my membership envelope finally arrived. The tulips were just beginning to bloom, and I'd gotten scolded for picking a few to decorate the kitchen table. But right after her lecture, Mom handed me a small square letter. The back read, "Welcome to the Z Show fan club." Inside was a leaflet welcoming me to the club and a small ID card with my name on it. The card had the Z Show's logo, the words "Fan Club Member" in bold black letters, and my name in smaller print. Brandy's envelope arrived the same day. She was ecstatic, glowing as she showed off her card. Scarlett's envelope came 2 days later. Though initially jealous, she soon forgot about it. Every Friday after that, we each received a new leaflet about the show. Behind-the-scenes photos, fun facts, and occasional calls to action, like promoting the show or looking out for the Z Show tour. If their goal was to reignite our passion for the show, it worked. I proudly carried my membership card everywhere and didn't miss a single episode after that. In mid-June, we got 2 leaflets instead of 1. The first was the usual newsletter. The second was something far more exciting, an announcement. The Z Show tour is coming to your town. This is your chance to become an elite member. The leaflet promised that the tour bus would arrive the following Sunday. The main characters would be there to greet everyone and play games. Anyone who participated in at least 4 games would be upgraded to elite member status and receive a golden membership card. Those 9 days were agonizing. Brandy, Scarlett, and I spent every moment planning how we'd take photos with the characters, compete in the games, and finally earn our golden cards. I secretly fantasized about beating Scarlett in the trivia game. On Saturday, Scarlett went to a birthday sleepover and was supposed to be back by noon on Sunday. But by 12:30, there was still no sign of her. Brandy, buzzing with excitement, knocked on our back door and begged us to leave early so we wouldn't miss anything. Her mom had volunteered to drive us. Mom called the friend's house, but no one answered. She insisted we wait for Scarlett. By 12:45, Brandy's mother came over. She said we really needed to leave to avoid long lines. Brandy, near tears, was terrified of missing her chance to meet the characters. Her mom decided to take her without us. I wanted to go so badly. I cried and begged. But Mom was firm. "We'll go as soon as Scarlett gets here," she said. I felt punished for something that wasn't my fault. Scarlett arrived at 1:40, and by the time we reached the parking lot, it was already crowded. From a distance, we could see a large group of parents gathered in a semicircle. My mom spotted Brandy's mother among them, looking distraught. As we approached, her anxious expression made my stomach tighten. Brandy's mom explained what had happened. The tour bus had arrived, emblazoned with the Z Show logo. Characters in animal suits had greeted the children and handed out sweets. They announced that a special set had been built outside town, where kids could make their own short film with the characters. The kids were loaded onto the bus first, and a few parents went along to chaperone. The rest were told the next bus would arrive shortly to take them to the set. But the second bus never came. When I heard this, I was both panicked and desperate. I begged my mom to wait for the next bus, certain it would arrive soon. I didn't notice how pale Brandy's mother had become. I didn't understand why the police arrived less than an hour later. The following Monday, an episode of the Z Show aired. One of the characters broke from their usual cheerful routine to deliver a somber message. They urged children to call their parents to the screen. My mom, already sitting with Scarlett and me, stiffened. The character explained that the Z Show had no official fan club. Brandy's parents cried endlessly that week. I convinced myself she was okay. Maybe she'd had so much fun she didn't want to come back. Then on Friday, a small parcel arrived at Brandy's house. Inside was a golden membership card with her name on it. It read, "Elite Member," in bold letters. The package also contained a videotape. The video was only a minute long. It showed Brandy at the set, still wearing the dress she'd had on that Sunday morning. She stood beside a character in an oversized animal suit. The figure loomed silently next to her, their costumes' bright colors stark against the dimly lit backdrop. Brandy's smile looked strange, too wide, too fixed. "Hi, Mom," she said in a voice that trembled just slightly. "I really like it here. I wish you could be here too." She laughed, a high, brittle sound. "I'm sorry the others were late. I'm sure they would have loved it." The tape cut to static.
The Smokey Pit. Nestled in the heart of a small, unassuming southern town was a barbecue joint called the Smokey Pit. It wasn't flashy, just a weathered building with a faded wooden sign swinging in the breeze. The place had a reputation that stretched far beyond the town's borders. Locals and travelers alike swore by the food, claiming it was the best barbecue they'd ever had. The meat was tender to the point of disbelief, the flavors impossibly rich. Yet there was something peculiar about the restaurant. It was only open from 6 p.m. to midnight, Wednesday through Saturday, and the pitmaster, Tom Carter, was a man of few words. Tom was wiry and weathered, with deep-set eyes that seemed to bore into you. He rarely spoke, never smiled, and operated the pit like it was an ancient ritual. Rumors swirled about his secret recipes and his refusal to let anyone else work in the kitchen. It only added to the mystique of the place, drawing in people who were as curious about Tom as they were hungry for the food. One evening, a food blogger named Matt rolled into town. He was chasing hidden gems for his blog and had stumbled across mentions of the Smokey Pit in obscure forums. The comments were strange, cryptic. Don't ask too many questions, and it's unforgettable, but not in the way you think. Matt was intrigued, but not easily spooked. He prided himself on uncovering the stories behind food, no matter how strange or elusive. When Matt arrived at the Smokey Pit, the line was already snaking out the door. The smoky aroma hung heavy in the air, pulling him forward. It wasn't just appetizing, it was intoxicating. As he waited, he overheard snippets of conversation. "It's not just the taste," a man whispered to someone beside him. "It's like it gets inside you, you know." Matt smirked, thinking it was all part of the hype. Finally, it was his turn. He stepped up to the counter, and there was Tom, staring at him with an unsettling intensity. "What'll it be?" Tom asked, his voice gravelly and clipped. Matt ordered the sampler platter, eager to try everything. Before handing over the food, Tom leaned in close and said, "Eat, enjoy, but don't snoop. This place has rules." Matt brushed off the warning, assuming it was just part of the mystique. The first bite of the barbecue was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. The meat was so tender it practically dissolved on his tongue, and the flavors were a symphony of smokiness, sweetness, and spice. It wasn't just delicious, it was transcendent. He felt a strange warmth radiating through his body as if the food were filling him with something more than just nourishment. Around him, other diners ate in reverent silence, their faces blank with bliss. Matt was hooked, but as a food blogger, he needed more than just the taste to write about. He needed the story. How was it possible to make barbecue this good? What was Tom's secret? Later that night, after the restaurant closed, Matt parked his car across the street and waited. Around 1 a.m., he saw Tom emerge from the back of the building, hauling a heavy sack toward a shed behind the restaurant. The sack seemed oddly shaped, and the way Tom struggled with its weight made Matt's stomach churn. When Tom disappeared into the shed, Matt crept closer, his curiosity overriding his common sense. As he neared the shed, the smell changed. It wasn't the mouth-watering smokiness from earlier. This was sour, metallic, and wrong. The shed door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, Matt saw Tom kneeling over a large rectangular pit. Flames licked the air, and it was clear this wasn't a smoker. It was an open fire pit. Tom hefted the sack into the flames, and it landed with a sickening thud. The fire roared, illuminating Tom's face, which was twisted into a grotesque grin. Matt's breath caught. He stumbled backward, his foot hitting a metal bucket. The clang echoed in the still night. Tom's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto Matt's. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Tom whispered, "You shouldn't have done that." Matt turned and ran, his heart pounding. He didn't look back, but he could hear heavy footsteps behind him. He reached his car, fumbling with the keys, and sped off into the night. His hands shook as he drove to his motel. What had he just witnessed? Back at the motel, Matt decided to call the police. But as he reached for the phone, there was a knock at the door. His blood ran cold. "Matt," a voice called softly. It was Tom. Matt held his breath, backing away from the door. The doorknob rattled. "You should have listened," Tom said, his voice calm and low. Then, just as suddenly, the footsteps retreated. When Matt finally opened the door hours later, there was no one there, but a greasy, charred smear was left on the handle. In the days that followed, Matt tried to report what he'd seen, but the local authorities dismissed him. "Tom Carter, that man's been running the Smokey Pit for decades. Never had a single complaint," they said. Matt dug deeper and discovered that missing persons cases spiked every few years in the area, always around the same time as the Smokey Pit's busiest seasons. And then there was the strangest part. No one had ever worked alongside Tom. No sous chefs, no servers, no delivery drivers. Just him. Determined to find answers, Matt returned to the town months later. But the Smokey pit was gone. The building had been reduced to ashes, as if it had never existed. Locals claimed Tom left town after a fire destroyed the place. Some said he retired. Others whispered that he'd been taken by the spirits he appeased with his barbecue. Matt couldn't let it go. He still tasted the barbecue sometimes, waking up in the middle of the night with the flavor on his tongue. No matter how much he brushed his teeth, it lingered. And sometimes, in the shadows of his dreams, he saw Tom, always smiling, always watching. One morning, Matt found a greasy, charred smear on his bathroom counter.